This is Townsquare Sunday. When someone writes a book about 19th century whaling, people in New Bedford seem to take notice. Author Marsha Hall Brown has written a very interesting book about whaling, about family, and about spending 9 years at sea with that family. The book is entitled Under Sun, Stars, and Sails, A Whaling Family's Life at Sea. And Marsha Hall Brown is with us today to discuss that book. So welcome, Marsha.
Thank you, Phil. It's very good to be here.
All right. This is a book about one particular family. But first, let me ask you, you're a seasonal resident of Nantucket?
I was until very recently.
Okay.
Yes.
Did that island's history really prompt you to write the book? I suppose it had a big factor in it.
Well, the island history, as well as the fact that I inherited a number of artifacts, letters, and manuscripts from the Marshall family and the Pinkham family of Nantucket. And that is really what triggered this interest. When I was 22, I received the first letter, and it was a very detailed letter about Melvina Marshall's trip across the Isthmus of Panama. And she was on her way to meet her husband in Pieta, Peru. And the only way to get there was across the isthmus. This is way before the canal, and it was full of people because, as you know, this happened in 1852. The gold rush in California was 49, so this route across the isthmus was jammed with people from everywhere in the world.
This is the story of Captain Joseph Marshall and his wife Marvina, who became partners in this whaling venture, which was very unusual for its time, the 19th century. How unusual was it?
Well, Melvina was the daughter of a sea captain, but her mother had never gone to sea. So she was prepared, sort of, but until she got on the ship, and then there were things that she had never known about. It wasn't rare, but it wasn't common either. There were women who were going to sea, and they were taking one or two children with them. In this case, Melvina gave birth in the Azores. She went to sea 6 months pregnant. So this is a little bit more courage than many of them had.
And this is, I'm going to make it clear to our listeners, this is a true life story. This really happened.
Yes.
And this book is based on your research and the documents and letters that you have received about this family.
That's true, indeed. And I had heard a number of family stories. However, my research had to clarify those and make sure they were accurate. Of course, I also use ship's logs and ship's journals, and there's a difference between the two of them. A journal gets into more detail, and so therefore, between all of that, I came out with, I think, as close to the truth about these situations and events as I possibly could.
And was this one voyage, or I don't think so. I think probably a couple of voyages anyway.
Yes, it was 9.5 years in total, but there were two voyages, one from 1851 to 56, and the other one from 56 to 61.
Those are incredibly long periods of time to be out on the water.
Yes, they are. Indeed, they are. And they're lonesome. They're quiet many times. A lot of people think that all they do is kill whales all the time they're gone, but that's not quite true. There are very, very long periods that nothing happens, where morale goes very low and there are problems on board, and there are all kinds of strategies that the captain and the mates have to use to keep the seamen from really being discouraged.
So let's talk about some of that. First of all, Captain Marshall, was he a prominent captain in Nantucket? Was he someone?
By the time he left New Bedford on the Sea Queen, he was indeed. He was a master mariner, and that means that he was licensed and approved to sail any size ship anywhere in the world. That's what a master mariner was in those days. So he was already 22 years at sea, so he was very experienced, very knowledgeable.
And as you say, Marvina came from a whaling family herself, so she knew the business.
Yes, Melvina knew a great deal about the business of whaling, But as I suggested, her mother had never gone to sea, so she did not have a first-person account of the things that she would be confronted with on board a ship. For example, to be a woman with 30 seamen, 4 officers, her husband, and then a baby was quite something when you think of how small those ships were. They were only 100 feet long, and if you measured the deck space, it would be about the size of a basketball court, so people can visualize how tight things were as far as how much space there was for a woman. Plus, it was a dirty and a dangerous business. The decks were often slick with either oil or with blubber or the remnants of blubber. The smoke was smelly when they started the fire in the try works. So we're talking about a type of environment that one is just amazed that a woman lived all that and then went back for a second voyage.
That's what amazed me about it. I said, gee, this is
Indeed.
This is a woman who deeply loved her husband or didn't want to be away from her husband.
She didn't want to be away. And from their marriage, from the first year of their marriage, he was away 4 years. And I think she felt that was enough. She would just go with him. The other thing that makes her a little bit different from some of the women who went to sea was the fact she was very well educated. She was mathematically superior. And when she went to sea, she was truly a partner, not just in the business, but in the workings of the navigation, because she's the one who could keep the maps charted correctly. She was a whiz at math, and so therefore to figure out the logarithms was not difficult for her. In fact, some would say she was probably faster than her husband and the mates at doing the math.
Mm-hmm. So we should talk a little bit about researching this book. Letters were sent to you.
Given to me, yes.
Given to you.
Indeed.
Okay.
They were held, and that's another thing that makes my book, a little bit special, not just to me, but as far as a historical record. These letters and manuscripts and memoirs have been held in family possession, and they've never been used for any purpose until very recently. Nantucket Historical Association now have all the letters. They have some of the manuscripts. I still retain some of them, but they've never been published before.
And that's basically where you drew your information from?
I drew a great deal of it. Helen Marshall, who was the child who was born in the Azores, she left a very careful memory book and outlining some of her experiences. So I have direct quotations of how she remembers her trip, which is extremely valuable, first-person account.
That's an amazing resource there to have.
Oh, absolutely.
Did you have to go through any other historical society records besides those records that you've mentioned?
No, I inherited them.
You inherited them.
I inherited them.
And did you know a lot about whaling before you took on this task?
Yes, a little bit. But as you can imagine, the details of whaling are quite significant. And I really had, like most people have, a rather glorified view, the movie type of view of what goes on.
Mm-hmm.
Just as I suggested that it was a really dirty, dangerous place for anybody, let alone a woman and child. But the other thing that was going on these whaling ships, did you realize that there were a lot of animals on board? And nobody ever tells you that until you do careful reading. They never show it in movies. It's always some big drama on board. But there were chickens. There were lots of pigs. That was the favorite thing that they took with them. There were goats, especially lactating goats, so that they had a source of some milk. And occasionally they would have 1 or 2 bullocks on board. Can you imagine? All that, plus all those people, plus the business they had to do.
I can't imagine.
No.
But clearly they had, these are basically for food purposes, these animals. And it was an attempt to, if you're going to stay out at sea for 4 years or more, well, you've got to have some source of food. Now, it wasn't. They also stopped at ports of, I would say ports of call. They weren't really ports of call. They were, in some cases, exotic ports. In some cases, maybe not so exotic. Tell us about what you learned about that.
Well, let me tell you about one of the ports that they put into, because this is rather an extraordinary story. When the baby that was born, her name was Helen Marshall, they called her Nellie after the fact. And when they got to the Marquesa Islands, they threw an anchor over and they sent a boat in to the Marquesas. Joseph Marshall knew the protocol to be used for safety, because the Marquesa Islands were really not safe to go in to visit the tribes or to see the tribes. But they did need to get vegetables, fruits, and whatever else they needed, especially water. Fresh water was really important. So the captain sent a boat in asking to trade, sent gifts, and yes, there would be a trade. But what the protocol was, he took a high-ranking hostage on board the Aurora, his ship, until all the trading was done. And that provided safety not only for him, but his family. So he actually took his 6-year-old daughter, Nellie, on shore in the Marquesas, and she tells this in her own words, where she stands next to her father and he says, "Don't let go of my hand. Don't say a word. Just be very quiet." And she said the natives took turns feeling my hair, touching my skin. They couldn't believe that I was so white, and they had never seen hair like mine, but they didn't threaten to take me away. And she said, "I think the reason," this is Nellie writing years later, "I think the reason was I was a very skinny child, and I probably wouldn't have made much to eat in a pot."
Well, you're listening to Townsquare Sunday. My guest is Marsha Hall Brown. She's the author of Under Sun, Stars, and Sail, A Whaling Family's Life at Sea. It's published by Spinner Publications in New Bedford. How is it working with Spinner?
It's working so well. Joe Thomas is amazing to work with, and the staff there is really top-notch. Jay Avila has provided me with illustrations that are just significant, some of which I didn't even know existed, and he's a great researcher. And, of course, Susan Grace has helped with publicizing and so forth. They couldn't be better.
Great. So we learn now, maybe we didn't know this, or maybe we did, but we didn't recognize it, that there were animals on board these whaling ships that left Nantucket and, I'm sure, New Bedford. What else may the reader learn about Yankee whaling that perhaps they didn't know? Anything else?
There are a number of things that occurred. The fact that there is not a lot of there's not a lot of activity all the time on a whaling ship. We seem to think that there were whales all the time being taken, and sometimes it could be a month or two between the taking of whales. And so therefore there were a lot of crafts that were practiced. For example, the sailors made Nellie a jump rope so she would get better exercise, and that jump rope is in the Nantucket Whaling Museum. It's a beautiful rope with Turk's head's ends, and the handles are made out of whalebone ivory, and it's just beautiful, and it's in excellent condition. So lots of things that were going on board. Of course, Melvina and Joseph would meet and shoot the sun. That means that they would take a sighting every day about noontime, and then they would chart it. So that was going on. The sailors, many of them had musical interests, and so therefore they would try to pass the time with some degree of music. But other than that, it was really pretty boring until they got into port. And then, of course, the sailors, by turns, by groups, would go ashore, and that provided a completely different situation, especially in some of the exciting ports like Lahaina on Maui. That was a typical port they put into. And it also meant that the Marshall family could live on shore for perhaps 3 weeks, even a month if the ship was being refitted in some way. And they would live in in a lovely place with lots of wonderful food and have a complete break from being on the board ship.
I would think they would need it.
Yes.
Certainly. Were there distinct differences? Have you learned about any distinct differences between Nantucket, the Nantucket whaling scene, and what was happening in New Bedford, or was it pretty much the same?
It was pretty much the same, however. The largest group of whale ships originally came from Nantucket, but New Bedford was the place that continued and became greater than any other port after the years went by, simply because the ships got bigger, the whale ships got much larger, much heavier, they were carrying more weight, more ballast, and so therefore it was not even a question of getting them into the port of Nantucket. So they all transferred to New Bedford. In fact, both of the ships that the Marshalls sailed on left New Bedford, not Nantucket. These whale ships were built right here in Dartmouth, and they were registered out of Westport. So this is a local situation.
Yeah, clearly. Well, Nantucket we consider a local, but that's a New Bedford touch to this story as well. What's your favorite part of this book, Marsha? What did you have the most fun telling the story about?
I think there are two parts that came across as being really important. First of all, the fact that Melvina Pinkham Marshall was really a very unusual woman, a woman before her time. That not only was she willing to go on this trip, but she added to the trip. And the second part was the fact that the family dynamic of the Marshalls together was really interesting in that Joseph Marshall took his daughter not only on the shore at the Marquesas, but he took her on a business trip up the Tumbes River in Peru, and she rode in front of him in the saddle. So it wasn't just Melvina teaching and homeschooling her child at sea and doing navigation, but also Joseph participating in parenting, and I don't think that happened very much.
Where can people find the book? Anywhere, perhaps?
Well, tomorrow night I will be giving a program at the Barnes & Noble store in Dartmouth, so that's very local, and I would be delighted to see people. I'll be doing a book signing, a Q&A, and in addition to that, of course, they'll be available at the museum in New Bedford.
Whaling Museum.
The Whaling Museum in New Bedford, and certainly Moby Dick Specialties, the Partners Book Shop, Phoenix Gift Shop right here in Fairhaven. Those are just some of the bookstores that would be available. And, of course, autographed copies will be available through Spinner. Just go to their website, spinnerpub.com.
Very good. My thanks to Marsha Hall Brown, the author of Under Sun, Stars, and Sails, A Whaling Family's Life at Sea. Really a true account of Captain Joseph Marshall and the Nantucket whaling scene, including his wife, Melvina, who, as Marsha has described, a remarkable woman, way ahead of her time. Good luck with this book.
Thank you so much, Phil, and thank you for having me.
Very good. Townsquare Sunday returns in just a moment.